Hi guys, welcome back to my channel. If you're new here, my name is Tiffany, but you can call me Tiff. And today I'm doing another True Crime Tuesday. So this used to be a Tasty True Crime Tuesday, but I've decided I'm not going to be doing the tasty part anymore. I'm just going to be doing the True Crime Tuesday from now on, which will make my life easier, and I'm sure you will enjoy it more because you won't have to watch me stuff my face at the beginning. Today we're going to be talking about the Little Miss murder. Lisa Marie Kimmell was born on the 18th of July 1969 in Covington, Tennessee, and she was the eldest of three daughters born to Sheila and Ronald Kimmell. Lisa was born in Tennessee because her father Ron was stationed with the Marines at that point, but shortly after, in 1972, Lisa and her family, they moved to Billings, Montana, and this is where Sheila gave birth to Lisa's two younger siblings, and this is where they raised their family. When Lisa graduated from high school, she decided to get a job at a restaurant called Arby's, and this restaurant Arby's was located in Colorado near Denver, and Lisa's mum Sheila was actually the area manager or the regional manager of the restaurant at the time that Lisa worked there as well. And it's said that Lisa really enjoyed this job at Arby's, and she must have done a pretty good job because at 18 she was actually promoted to manager of the restaurant, which is a big achievement for an 18-year-old. And also Arby's was around 555 miles away from their family home back in Billings, Montana. So that's around 7 hours away, a 7-hour drive from their family home to the restaurant. So Sheila and Lisa must have really loved the job, because there's no way in hell I would be traveling 7 hours for a job. Okay, there's no way. Anyway, Sheila and Lisa didn't actually commute on a day-to-day basis. From what I can gather, Sheila actually was put up in accommodation by Arby's, but Lisa actually decided to move to Denver. So she decided to leave the family home and move to Denver. Sheila and Ron at first were a bit worried about this, but then Sheila thought, well, I'm in Denver most of the time anyway because of Arby's, so it's fine. Now, even though Lisa really enjoyed her job at Arby's, Sheila and Ron did really encourage Lisa to go to college, and college in America is university here in the UK. And Lisa was actually offered a scholarship in accounting, but Lisa declined the scholarship offer, even though Sheila and Ron kind of were pushing her to, go to college. But instead Lisa said, no, I don't want to go to college yet. I don't want an office job. I want to stay at Arby's because, like I said, she really enjoyed it. And it's said that Sheila and Ron kind of, backed down and said, okay, like, if that's really what you want to do, but we're going to revisit the idea of you going to college next year, which Lisa agreed to, but sadly that could never happen. From very early on, Lisa was said to be really mature, independent and determined. And to give you a few examples of this, at 16 years old, Lisa wanted a waterbed. So instead of asking her mum and dad or her family to pay for it for her, Lisa actually took this waterbed out on a loan, on finance, and she actually paid for this. She paid it off, like, she didn't miss any payments. She paid it off, paid it all on time, and I actually believe that she paid it off early because she was just like so organised. And then Lisa also, I think around the time of 17, 18, decided that she wanted to get a car. And once again, instead of asking her family or her parents to buy the car for her, Lisa actually paid for this car herself. And this car was a black 1988 Honda CRX, and Lisa loved this car. She paid for it herself, and she also paid for a very unique and special license plate. And this license plate said Lil Miss. Now, this is why this case is called the Lil Miss murder case. And the reason Lisa got this customized license plate is because Lil Miss is what Lisa's grandmother used to call her when she was younger, and then it kind of, stuck, and then everyone in her family kind of associated Lil Miss with Lisa. Now, like I said earlier, Lisa made the decision to move to Denver so she could be closer to the restaurant, so she wouldn't have to go back and forth like 7 hours drive every day. Now, even though Lisa lived in Denver, she did try and go home or back to the family home in Billings whenever she could, like whenever she had a spare weekend, she would always drive back and spend the weekend or whatever time she had off with her family. And this was supposed to be the plan for the 25th of March 1988. And this trip was a really special one because Lisa wasn't just going home by herself. She was actually taking her boyfriend Ed home with her so he could meet her parents, Sheila and Ron, for the first time. Now, Lisa and Ed, they met through mutual friends, and it is said from the get-go, as soon as they met, they just kind of hit it off, and it was almost like fate. They were, you know, they were just drawn to each other. So they started a relationship pretty quickly. The only thing is that Ed actually lived in Cody, Wyoming. From Cody, Wyoming to Denver, Colorado, it was like a 7-hour drive. So it was almost like a long distance relationship, to be honest. Like, they didn't really see a lot of each other. They communicated mostly by telephone or writing letters to each other. So the plan for Friday the 25th of March was for Lisa to finish work. So she was going to finish her shift at 3 p.m. at Arby's, and then once she'd finished, she was going to drive to Cody, Wyoming, stay with Ed on the Friday night, and then on the Saturday morning, they were going to drive back to Billings, Montana. And this journey in total would have been like 14 hours of driving. When Lisa told Sheila, her mum, of her plans, Sheila wasn't very happy because, like I said, in total it was going to be around 14 hours of driving, and Sheila just wasn't comfortable with it. She just felt like it could be quite dangerous driving for that long, but also she knew that Lisa was going to be driving to Cody probably in the dark. It was going to be late. She's going to have to finish work, she's going to have to go home, get her stuff, and then drive to Cody, which was around 7 hours. So she wasn't going to arrive in Cody until about 1 a.m. on the 26th of March. So Sheila was really kind of nervous and worried about this, and she actually said, look, why don't I come with you? Why don't I change my plans? Because Sheila was actually meant to be catching a flight back home on that Friday, because Ron and Sheila had plans to go skiing on the Saturday, the morning of the 26th. And Sheila said, instead of me catching the flight home, I'll cancel it and I'll drive with you to Cody. And Lisa was like, no, like, Mum, honestly, it's fine. The fact that she only had a 2-seater as well was one of the major factors that Lisa said no, like, because where's Ed gonna sit then? And like I said, Lisa was really trustworthy. She was really organised, mature. She wasn't a silly 18-year-old. She wasn't an immature 18-year-old. She was really sensible. And Lisa convinced Sheila and said, look, it's going to be absolutely fine. I'm just going to finish work. I'm going to drive there, stay the night, and then come to the family home the next day on the 26th. So Lisa was like, okay, fine, like, you're an adult, if that's what you want to do, but I am offering to drive with you. And Lisa said, no, Mum, it's fine. So on that Friday, on the 25th, Lisa went to work. She worked her shift at Arby's, and then she finished at 3 p.m. And records show that Lisa had called Ed around 4 p.m. And according to Ed, Lisa rang and said that she was running a little bit late. She wasn't going to be leaving Denver until about 5 o'clock. We then know that Lisa was driving through Douglas, Wyoming at around 9 p.m. and the reason we know that is because Lisa actually got pulled over for speeding. A patrol officer pulled her over and said, like, why are you going like 22 miles over the limit? And Lisa explained that she was trying to get to her boyfriend's house, like, she'd finished work, she was really tired, and that's why she was driving really fast. Obviously, because she'd been pulled over for speeding, Lisa actually got a fine for this. From what I can gather, in Wyoming, or in a lot of states in America, if you're caught speeding, you're given a fine, but you have to pay that fine like immediately on the spot, and if you don't have the money, they'll arrest you and they'll put you in a holding cell until someone can come and pay the fine for you. And the reason that they do this is because a lot of people that are driving on the highway, they're literally driving to get to a different state. So it's more than likely that if someone's given a fine and they don't pay it on the spot then and there, they're going to get to their destination and they're not going to pay the fine. Lisa was given a $120 fine for speeding that she had to pay on the spot. $120, that's a lot of money to me. Anyway, Lisa only had around $40 in cash on her. So Lisa told the patrol officer that she only had $40 on her and she would need to go to the ATM to get the rest of the money out. So the officer agreed to follow Lisa to the ATM so she could get the money out. But as luck would have it, when Lisa got to the ATM, the machine was a different provider than the card that she had, so it wouldn't actually take her card. So I think back in the 80s, if your card issuer was different from the ATM bank, it wouldn't accept it. So she was kind of stuck then. She was like, well, I don't know what else to do now. So the officer, you know, spoke to Lisa, and he could just tell that she was a lovely girl. She was 18 years old, she was young, she was very petite, she was very soft-spoken, very polite. And the officer, he kind of just knew that Lisa would pay it. Like, he said to Lisa, if you promise to pay the fine when you get home, then I'll just let you go. I won't take you into the holding cell, I won't take you into jail. And Lisa promised and said, yes, absolutely, as soon as I get home, I will send a check for the fine. So the officer then said, okay, like, that's fine, you just get back on your way. And Lisa actually asked the officer for directions so she could get back on the right track, because she wasn't familiar with the area, so she was kind of a bit lost by that point. So the officer gave her the directions and he said, okay, bye-bye, don't forget to pay the fine. And then Lisa went back on her way. And the officer was actually wearing a recorder, I believe. So it wasn't like a video camera, but it was a voice recording, and all of this was recorded on his little recorder. Now, the next unconfirmed sighting of Lisa was at a petrol station between 10 or 10:30 on that Friday night, but this sighting has never been confirmed, so take that with a pinch of salt, because I'm not 100% sure if it was definitely Lisa. But this sighting is believed to probably be the last time that Lisa was ever seen alive, because after this, Lisa just seemed to disappear. So like I said earlier, Lisa was driving to Cody to pick up Ed, or to stay the night with Ed, and Ed was expecting Lisa to arrive at his house around 1 AM on the 25th of March, the Saturday. And whilst Ed was waiting for Lisa, he actually fell asleep, and then he woke up around 7 AM and he realised that Lisa hadn't turned up. So Ed decided to call the highway patrols and report that Lisa hadn't arrived, but she'd been driving on these different highways. And I'm not sure why, but at that point they didn't tell Ed about Lisa being stopped for speeding. I'm not sure if it hadn't been logged at that point, but at that moment in time, Ed kind of was told that there wasn't really much they could do. He provided the patrol officers with the model of Lisa's car, and he also mentioned about her personalised driving licence. So the patrol officers, they said to Ed that they was going to log this as an overdue arrival report. So it's important to note that this was not a missing persons report. And the reason for that is that because back then they had to wait 72 hours before they could log someone as missing. I mean, 72 hours, that's so long. In this day and age, it's not the case. Like, you don't have to wait 24 hours, you don't have to wait 72 hours. As soon as you realise that someone's missing, you can report them as missing. But back then they had to wait 72 hours. So the patrol officer said that to Ed. He said, I can't log her as missing at the moment because it hasn't been 72 hours. If she doesn't arrive by Monday, let us know and we're going to log it as a missing persons report. Ed tried to call Sheila and Ron because he thought maybe Lisa had decided to just drive straight home to Billings instead of coming to pick him up. I mean, she would have probably called him and told him that the plans had changed if that was the case, but you know, at this point he's just trying to think of different scenarios as to why she hadn't turned up, and he wasn't thinking the worst at that point. But anyway, Ed couldn't get through to Sheila or Ron because they were actually skiing. Like I mentioned earlier, they was going skiing in the morning. And then Ed thought that maybe Lisa may have stopped in Casper for the night. So Casper is like in the middle of Denver and Wyoming. It's like smack bang in the middle. And they actually had a mutual friend that lived in Casper. So Ed thought that maybe Lisa had contacted this friend and said, can I stay the night? Because it was a really, really long drive and it was really late at night. So he contacted this mutual friend and he said, did Lisa stay with you last night? And this friend was like, no, like, I haven't heard from Lisa, I haven't seen her. Ed said, okay, look, I can't find her, I don't know where she's gone. Can you just keep an eye out and can you just ring around and see if anyone's seen her? The friend was obviously like, yeah, of course. And they were really concerned. They were really concerned for Lisa at this point. But I don't think they thought there was foul play involved. I think at this point in time, they thought that Lisa may have been involved in a car accident or a car crash. And this is because Lisa had been involved in a car crash back in December when she was driving home for Christmas. So I think at this point they're thinking she's probably been involved in a car accident. So Ed decided to call around the hospitals to see if Lisa had been taken in, possibly, but he was told that no, there was no one under that name that had been brought in. Now, when Sheila and Ron returned home from skiing, they were expecting for Lisa and Ed to be there, but obviously they hadn't turned up, and at that point Sheila wasn't too concerned. She thought that they probably were just running late, maybe they'd had a lie-in. But then Sheila started getting phone calls and they were asking if Lisa had turned up, had she been found, was she okay? And Sheila was wondering like what are they on about? And the reason that Sheila was getting these calls is because the friend that lives in Casper, they had rang around and they was asking all of their friends, all of their mutual friends, if they'd seen Lisa. Lisa had disappeared on the highway. This then got back to Sheila. Ed then managed to get through to Sheila and he told Sheila everything that he knew, and he said that he'd spoken to Lisa, she was running late, she was driving to him on the Friday, but she seemed to just disappear. Now obviously Sheila and Ron are really worried, and once again they're thinking that there's a big chance, a big possibility that Lisa could have been involved in a car accident. I believe that Sheila and Ron, they had some friends in the police department, and they decided to call and they said, look, our daughter's gone missing on the highway, like we want to report her as missing and we want to know if there's any information. At this point, Sheila and Ron were then informed about the speeding fine that she'd been pulled over in Douglas. So they figured the best place to start looking for Lisa was in Douglas, because that was the last time that she'd been seen. So Ed decided to drive down from Wyoming to Billings, and then Sheila, Ron and Ed were gonna go and search for Lisa. And I know that Sheila and Ron, they kind of gathered search parties, so they all went out to Douglas and they searched the area thoroughly. Like, they even hired their own helicopter because they were thinking if they could find Lisa's car with the Little Miss license plate that couldn't really be misidentified, there was a high chance that they would find Lisa too. So they hired their own helicopter. The helicopter flew around looking to see if it could find the car, but they couldn't. The car had disappeared as well as Lisa. They had search parties on foot. Ron was driving around in his car looking for Lisa. Like they did everything. And because they had friends in the police force, they were able to log Lisa as missing 48 hours after she'd gone missing, not 72. I mean, 48 hours is still a long time to me, but you know, at least they got an extra day, I guess. So after Lisa was reported missing, the police were out, they were searching for Lisa, they were trying to find her car, but once again Lisa's car and Lisa just seemed to have disappeared. Like, there was just no sign of her car or Lisa at all. The police announced to the public that Lisa had gone missing, and loads of tips started coming in. And Lisa's car, the black Honda CRX, it was like your standard average car. A lot of people had this car, but obviously Lisa had the unique number plate. Now, because Lisa had the unique number plate, the police were thinking, great, this is going to be kind of easy to identify Lisa's car. But unfortunately, people just started calling in every time they saw this model and make, regardless of the license plate. The police were kind of battling with the public, like, even though they were trying to help, every time this car got called in, it wasn't Lisa's. 6 days later, on the 2nd of April 1988, everyone's worst fears came true. A family was fishing in the North Platte River, which is located in Casper, and the father of the family, his name was Greg Bradford. He stood up on the bank to look at the river, and when he did, he saw the body of a young girl floating in the river, and Greg instantly connected the missing girl with this body, so he called it in straight away. The police obviously arrived at the scene. They got the body out of the river, and it took them a day to identify this body as Lisa Kimmell. Now, Lisa's body had clear signs of foul play. There was absolutely no denying that Lisa had been killed. Lisa had been beaten, she'd been bound, she'd been sexually assaulted, and the assailant had left behind traces of semen. But this wasn't all though. Lisa had been stabbed 6 times, but it was in like a circle pattern. Like they like stabbed her in like this strange pattern, and then once through the circle, so it was like a circle, and then absolutely bizarre. So because of this, the police started to think maybe it was some sort of cult killing. Anyway, they did look into that potential lead that it was a cult killing, but there was absolutely no evidence, no sign that that's what it was. They also collected the DNA from Lisa's body, and this DNA was obviously from an unknown male. And at the time, DNA testing was in its infancy, and the local police departments, they didn't have access to the labs or to the testing. But thankfully, the department did realise that this DNA could probably be what cracked the case. So they collected the DNA and they preserved it, so the DNA could be tested in the future. And thank God that they did this, because this is what cracked the case. Once news had come out about Lisa's body being found in the river, eyewitnesses came forward to say that they'd seen headlights on this bridge on the early hours on the 26th of March, the Saturday. And the witnesses said that they thought this was strange because the bridge was no longer in use and it was kind of closed off to the public, and the only way that you would know how to get to the bridge is if you were a local. So the police decided to go to this bridge, and sure enough, they found Lisa's blood at the scene. So they theorised whoever Lisa's killer was, they'd taken Lisa to this bridge, they'd probably knocked her out, and then they threw her over the bridge into the river. And they also believe, because of the eyewitnesses, that Lisa was most likely killed on the 26th of March 1988 in the early hours. So this is now turned from a missing persons case to a murder case, and everyone wanted to do whatever they could to catch Lisa's killer. They didn't want this person on their streets. Well, I say everyone, but there was one person that seemed to be really against finding Lisa's killer for some reason, and that person was Ron Ketchum. Now, Ron Ketchum was the sheriff for the police department, and for some reason, Ron Ketchum was just an absolute asshole. He just made it so much harder for the family. Lisa's family was pushing to get the FBI involved in the case because of one, of how Lisa was brutally murdered, but two, they also knew that the DNA found on Lisa's body would be tested because the FBI obviously had access to the DNA testing. So for some reason, Ron Ketchum, the sheriff, he was so against getting the FBI involved. Like, he was having none of it. And he said to the family, if you keep pushing to get the FBI involved, I'm gonna arrest you for interfering with police work. Like, I beg your fucking pardon? Like, our daughter has just been murdered, and then you're threatening her. I probably would have punched him in the face by then. I would have been arrested because I would have assaulted a police officer, 100% I would have. But regardless of these threats from Ketchum, the family still went ahead and they still pushed for the FBI to be involved, and eventually the FBI did get involved. And they did test the DNA that was found on Lisa's body, but it didn't match. It didn't match anyone that was in the database. So there was 2 questions on everyone's mind. The first was, who is Lisa's killer? And the second was, where is Lisa's car? In April 1989, the TV show Unsolved Mysteries actually aired an episode, and this episode covered Lisa's case. And this led to a lot of people calling in, but once again, none of these calls were accurate. Like, a lot of people probably did think they were trying to help, but it kind of just put more strain on the investigation. There were 2 sightings that seemed to be more reliable, I guess, and these were from the 26th and the 27th of March, so the year before. And 2 women came forward. They were separate witnesses. They came forward and they said they'd seen Lisa in her car, and they knew it was her car because they saw the Little Miss driving licence, and they said that there was a man in the car with her. But Lisa didn't seem scared. She didn't look like she was trying to, you know, get help or get anyone's attention. She seemed really calm and relaxed. Now, obviously this doesn't really make a lot of sense, because if Lisa was in the car with a man, we would have to presume that it was her killer, but Lisa wouldn't have stopped and picked up anyone, especially at night when it's dark. Like, Lisa wouldn't have done that, and it was creating more questions than it was answers. The police did try and follow every lead that came in because of the Unsolved Mysteries show, But it didn't lead to any answers, and the case just went cold. Like it just went cold. They didn't have any answers, and it seemed like this case would never ever be solved. That was until 2002, 14 years later, after Lisa had been killed. The DNA found on Lisa's body was put into CODIS, which is the database for DNA in America. They put the DNA into the database and they got a match. 14 years later, they got a match. This DNA belonged to 58-year-old Dale Wayne Eaton. Dale Eaton was serving prison time in the Englewood Federal Prison in Littleton, Colorado. You see, in 1997, Eaton was convicted of kidnapping a family at gunpoint. And let me tell you about this situation, okay? Because this family, they deserve a fucking medal. The Breeden family consisted of 3 members, a husband, a wife, and their baby. And they had broken down on the side of the highway, and Eaton stopped and pretended that he wanted to offer some help. And he said, "Get into my truck, I'll drive you to my brother's garage." He doesn't have a brother. "I'll drive you to my brother's garage and we'll get you some help." And the family, not thinking anything of it, were like, "Okay, yeah, cool, like thanks mate, you're really helping us out here." And then Eaton was like, "Oh, actually, can your wife drive the car because I'm really tired?" And they were like, "Okay, yeah, sure." So the husband was in the back with their baby and the wife was driving. And then when the wife started driving, Eaton got his gun out and was like, "Okay, I'm kidnapping you, like drive here, drive there." And the wife said to the husband, "Jump out the car with the baby." And he did. He jumped out the car with the baby. The wife then managed to kind of wrestle with Eaton, and she stopped the car and she got out of the car. The husband has then run over, got Eaton out the car, started beating him, like beating him to a pulp. And then Eaton kind of gave in and was like, "All right, like I give up basically. I give up, just leave me alone." Like, this family deserve a medal. I'm in absolute awe of that family, absolute awe. The only thing that I wish is that he would have hit him a little bit harder, because he deserves another punch in the face. The family kept Eaton there. They called the police came, they arrested Eaton. He was charged with attempted kidnapping, I believe, and this is when his DNA was put into the CODIS database. Whilst in prison, Eaton got himself into more trouble. He had a fight with his cellmate. They got into some sort of domestic, and Eaton punched him so hard. He punched him so hard that his cellmate died. And then he was arrested and charged with manslaughter. But get this, he was acquitted. He was acquitted. I mean, his lawyer must have been fantastic, because I don't know how he was acquitted for that. After getting a hit on the DNA, the police decided to go and visit Eaton's property. Whilst they were at Eaton's house, they decided to speak to the neighbours to see if they'd noticed anything odd. And the neighbours actually said that around the time of Lisa's disappearance, they noticed that Eaton had dug this massive hole in his garden, and he said that he was putting a septic tank in there, but this septic tank never arrived. They never saw him put it in to this hole. And on a hunch, the police decided to dig up the garden, and sure enough, I'm probably sure that you've guessed it by now, Lisa's car had been buried in his garden. Like, absolutely insane. It must have taken him hours. Did he drive it into the hole? I've got so many questions. When they removed Lisa's car from the hole, they also noticed that the Lil Miss number plate was still attached to the car. And this explains so much. This obviously explains why the car was never found. But it also leads to more questions, like how the hell did he get it in that hole? Like, how did he get it to the house? Did he drive it home? And this leads me to think that maybe the witnesses that said they saw Lisa with a man got confused. They didn't actually see Lisa, they just saw a man driving. I don't know, like so many questions still unanswered. Eaton was charged with 8 crimes connected to Lisa's case. He was charged with first-degree premeditated murder, aggravated kidnapping, aggravated robbery, first-degree sexual assault, and second-degree sexual assault. And a fellow inmate called Joseph Francis Dax, he actually testified at Eaton's trial, and he said that Eaton had confessed to him that he had murdered Lisa. Eaton told Joseph that Lisa had stopped and offered Eaton a ride Ethan had got in the car. He then made sexual advances towards Lisa. Lisa said no, and then she asked him to get out the car, and then this escalated to him kidnapping her and murdering her and raping her. Like, I don't believe it for an absolute second. Like, I just don't think there's any way that Lisa would have stopped in her car by herself in the middle of the night and offered a strange man a ride. I think it's more plausible that she was either stopping for a toilet break, or she stopped at a station, a petrol station that is, and he somehow kidnapped her, probably at gunpoint again, like he did with that poor family. Ethan was found guilty of all charges and he was sentenced to death, and he was scheduled to be put to death in February 2010. Now, I'm not sure why, but this death sentence was actually overturned in 2014. However, the state is still going for the death penalty. They're going to try and get him back on death row. And as of 2019, Ethan was awaiting a new sentencing hearing. We don't know what the outcome of that is yet. If Ethan is sentenced to death and if he is placed back on death row, he will be the only inmate in Wyoming to be on death row. The only one. Lisa's parents, Sheila and Ron, also decided to bring a civil lawsuit against Ethan as well, for wrongful death. And they obviously won the case, and they was awarded Ethan's property where Lisa's car was found, and they actually decided to knock down the houses and burn everything to the ground, including the land where Lisa's car was found. And they did this what would have been Lisa's 36th birthday, I believe. But that's the case that I have for you today, guys. I hope that you enjoyed it. If you did, please give it a thumbs up, subscribe to my channel if you haven't already, and I will see you in the next one. Bye.